Wonderful, productive, perhaps even inspiring conversations in small groups? Yeah. Hope so. Now let's move to our particular subject matter for today. So first, thank you for engaging those conversations to draw from what we've done the first couple of weeks. Today, our focus is land grabs in the plural. And we're conceptualizing this as going beyond development. So I want to ask you to please close your eyes, maybe not really, at least metaphorically. And when you hear the word development, what do you think of? What do you see? So get that image of what you think of and what you see. And then try to look beyond it. Look past it. Now, of course, I don't know what you conceived of, but our idea with calling this beyond development is to say we want to move beyond the traditional, the standard, the mainstream, the corporate presentation of what development is. And we want to move beyond it in a couple of different senses. One, in seeing something past it, seeing that there are other ways to conceptualize meeting our needs as a society. We also want to see beyond it in the sense of moving beyond the narratives, the stories, the images that are presented to us about what development is, what it looks like. If it looks like, for instance, a big, high, tall skyscraper owned by a billionaire, or a stadium, or these other big projects. We'll look beyond that, and beyond the images presented to us, beyond the stories and say that is what development is or must be. And in the third way, look beyond that in a sense to see what is lost in that image or that model, that experience of development. Who's displaced? Who is harmed? Whose resources are extracted? And who benefits in ways that the mainstream images try not to show us? So in all those ways, we would like to look beyond the standard presentation of what development is. And the way to do that is to see the different ways in which various powers that be, various forces have been taking land in various ways. So that's our focus today. And we'll do that in a few different ways. And first up will be Antonio. I believe. Adonde Antonio. Okay. So while he's coming up, let's welcome Antonio.
Turn my timer on. Cool. So nice to meet you guys. This is you can put in presentation mode, which is up at the top. Right here-ish.
This way you don't get a low tech person.
Yeah. What's that say?
Let's see what two low tech people can do.
He will just be clicking from here on out, I promise. Yes, he will just be clicking from here on out. So.
All right. I can
Well, so you go to the next slide. Eliza really asked me to, and some of it didn't come out actually, but if you wanted to take a picture of this is actually all of the indigenous people of the Detroit area and Michigan area. And I wanted to highlight the Wendat. They're part of the Haudenosaunee group, which is also known as the Iroquois. Can everybody say Wendat?
Wendat.
Wendat, cool. The next one are the Athwaki, Meskwaki, and the Kickapoo. But the more largely recognized indigenous people in this land who kind of migrated from the Atlantic coast are the Anishinaabe. Can we say Anishinaabe?
Anishinaabe.
And they include the Odawa, Ojibwe,
Ojibwe,
Potawatomi. So those are the indigenous peoples of this land. I think it's really important to start out presentations with that because a lot of people don't recognize that, don't discuss that, don't know that history. We can trace our supposed lineage of our civilization back to the Greeks and the Phoenicians and the Romans, but we don't know 250 years back of the land that we're standing on. The next slide. Hit it again. So these are the indigenous names that I've actually found of this land. So if you want to get a picture of that, that'd be good too. Opinago, Zagajabising, and Wawiatanam. All of those names really, by the indigenous folks, are oriented towards a bend in the river that happens at the Detroit. It's actually not a river, it's a strait. But there's a bend in the river which made it a very strategic location for the French to control the fur trade, because you could see further down a bend in the river. So the following slides, you could just kind of pass through them. So I reordered it, it didn't work. Anyways, so yeah, a really convenient, I think, a way to analyze what's happening in Detroit with land grabs, with colonization in general. Like, it's still happening to this day. It really connects colonization to race. Is this equation of red lands plus black labor equals white gold. Yeah, I think that captures it pretty well. I'm not going to go into too many details on that. Really stepping back a bit, the idea of neo-colonization is super relevant because the process of emergency management can very much be drawn parallels to what the IMF and the World Bank has been doing all over the world. Go to the next slide. For the last 150 years or so. So as World War II ended, the United States became the world's superpower, and we kind of forced Europe to give up its colonies all around the world. But the United States used another form of colonization through financial means, in which we gave questionable loans with extremely high interest rates to governments that we know couldn't pay them back. And when those governments couldn't pay back those loans, we forced them to privatize their public resources, public assets, water, electricity systems, and use U.S. corporations to do that. Same thing is happening in Puerto Rico, same thing is happening in Detroit. This is an inversion of this system that the United States has been doing internationally to urban communities, and I would say Detroit is really an internal colony within the United States. Next slide. So the emergency management law has then been this tool of white capital accumulation from a majority black city. So Detroit hasn't been a majority black city since like the 1970s and 80s is kind of like when the transition happened. Yet there's like this narrative that it's like black people's fault for managing the city into the ground, but the city was well into its decline in the 1950s after it had reached its peak. In that decade, it lost like 140,000 jobs to either the suburbs or the south. So how many of you guys know what the emergency manager law is without reading the screen? Somebody want to say what it is? Somebody.
Okay, what does it say?
It was an executive order that the governor signed it after the election in 2012 where he could appoint an emergency manager for, I believe it's 180 days without, and the emergency manager only was answered to the governor himself. And he could actually move him around too. He could like have him resign and reassign him too before there was a point where the public could have some kind of legal scrutiny process of the emergency management.
And an emergency manager was not elected, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So the emergency manager had dictatorial rules over all elected officials in the city. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, one question. I've been hearing that the emergency management system is still working, but they've changed the term from emergency management to several
So the emergency manager was from a law firm known as Jones Day. Jones Day is a bankruptcy law firm, and they ironically happen to be the law firm of our bankrupt ass president as well, Donald Trump. So you know they're scummy and dirty. So they were the official government for a little while. Now there's a fiscal control board, kind of like what's over Puerto Rico, that's over Detroit, that like stops city council from doing whatever they're doing. So you go to the next slide. So I graduated from Eastern Michigan in 2012, just as Detroit was getting put into bankruptcy. I was involved in like social movement spaces with a couple nonprofits, but none of their work was focused on the real major issues, which was like this neo-colonial takeover of Detroit that was happening just as I graduated. So I really got into doing graffiti that would speak against that, just to help put up like public art that was like anti-establishment. You get the next couple. And I started tagging, see the next one. Decolonize on the top of buildings. A lot of this stuff has since been covered up. You can do the next one. You go to this one. So we, as a collective, use hip hop as a way, and art as a way to bring people together, so we can engage them on these issues. And we find that people from oppressed communities generally have a much better understanding than white suburban folks about systems. You may know some of the language better, but you don't actually understand the reality of the essential kind of narrative. Like you ask black folks like what prison is about, it's a continuation of slavery. I mean, but like for white people, oh, police are here to defend us. Yeah, they are here to defend you and your property and capture slaves and push out indigenous peoples. It's been that way since the beginning of time. So we would organize events, bring people from our community together, and allow them to express themselves and discuss some of the things that they've observed. And as most of us were college graduates, we could put words to those systems to help them understand them. And these are two flyers from events. Another thing we use, this is like a graffiti sign. We use this 4-direction symbol to, next slide, to do the Motown slowdown. So when emergency manager was going down, like, we couldn't get our word out in the media, so we basically like shut down the freeways so like the people from the suburbs would feel the pain that we were feeling in the city by being late to work in the morning. Slide. This is an action that we did where we like interrupted a number of events that I can talk loud enough.
We'll get it.
Yeah, so this one was a state of the city address where we were like saying, shut up, Duggan, your narratives are like lies. This other one here was this WDET event where they were trying to like record, like 1 year after the bankruptcy, we did such a good job, like sort of thing. And we actually shut that event down totally. There was a corollary event that was supposed to happen at U of M, and we began to organize with U of M students, but some of y'all put a Facebook thing up, so they canceled the event altogether and didn't want to have it because they knew we were coming. So that was a really successful campaign. Next slide. So yeah, I wanted to talk about specific art actions that we did about land grabs that happened in Detroit, and these are two of the scummy people that we were targeting. The zombie-like creature you see here on your left is Mike Illich. He has since died, so zombie fits. And this other alcoholic-looking guy here on the right is Dan Gilbert. Next slide.
What's his name, the other guy?
Dan Gilbert. He owns Rock Financial. So I have a personal beef with Dan Gilbert, to be honest. In 2009, I was taking my finals at Eastern Michigan University when my mom called me and said, come home quick, the house is on fire. So it just so happened that the day my parents' house was getting taken from a loan that had originated from Quicken Loans was the day it like randomly caught on fire. So like I just remember picking up like yearbooks, family albums out of a garbage can that were like, you know, from my family. And that's something that happened to like 250,000 Detroiters in a city of 700,000. Think about 1 in 3 people lost their homes in the last 10 years in Detroit.
They're still doing it.
So when I talk about like land redistribution towards wealthy white people, towards upper, that's happening, that happened in your lifetime. And ask any of the black elders in the room. I mean, there's so many folks who lost their homes, lost their communities, places where grandmas and aunties were holding it down for 5, 6, 7 family members in one house and lost that home. That was the single greatest wealth loss for African American people since slavery. Literally, I mean, like you could have some parallels within the Reconstruction period when the South pulled, or the North pulled out of the South, and the whites began to take black farm owners' lands. This is like a parallel situation that's happening under emergency management under all of our noses. So, Opportunity Detroit is Dan Gilbert's marketing phrase for what he'd like to see in the city. And we say opportunity for who? You know, obviously he's trying to gentrify Detroit, not create opportunity in Detroit. So actually this piece on the left is from an article that I wrote in last year. It was called Gilbert's Trojan Horse, and you can find it in the Riverwise magazine. And that article was essentially about the way Dan Gilbert used a lot of public funds to channel them to increase the value of his properties along a 3-mile wide M1 rail. The M1 rail is the biggest joke in transportation since ever. I mean, like 26% of Detroiters don't have cars. And a lot of times the jobs that are accessible to us are in the suburbs, so we can't go to the suburbs to get that jobs. There was a In 2016, there was a law that was up to go on to fund a regional transit system. But as you guys should know by now, Detroit is one of the most segregated metropolitan areas in the entire country. And white folks in the suburbs don't want people of color coming into their communities because they feel afraid of them, because of racism. We have stupid ass like little train cars downtown. Yeah, anyways, it's a good article. Dan Gilbert sucks. This other piece, I wrote Zombieland on the top of this building, right where I think we call it Little Sleezer's Pizza, Little Sleezer's Arena. Yeah, instead of Caesars, Sleezers, because they're sleazy, dirty people. So, I mean, why I say that is because literally for 20 years, the Illiches were buying up property in the southern part of the Cass Corridor. And this is the Cass Corridor, not Midtown. Midtown's like the gentry branding for the area. But in the southern part of the Cass Corridor, he intentionally bought up over 70 properties and didn't develop them and let them slum out on purpose. So if you ask any older Detroiter what the Cass Corridor is about, this is where you get sex work and where you get drugs. A lot of people suffered silently for years because this asshole refused to develop this area, so he didn't have to pay higher prices for the other properties he was trying to accumulate. I mean, you remember all those parking lots that you go to for Tigers games and for Red Wings games? All that shit was intentionally underdeveloped by this scumbag here who waited till Detroit was in the process of emergency management so he wouldn't have to negotiate with a dictator as opposed to pay a fair market rate for the property he was trying to accumulate. You see what I'm saying? Illiches suck. I mean, there was like an article that came out that tried to like blackwash his legacy by saying he supported Rosa Parks at the end of his life. You shit on Rosa Parks' legacy for him. Goddamn, that was terrible. That shit drove me crazy. You want to say something?
So wasn't that the same strategy that to get the Brewsters? Because there really was nothing wrong with the Brewsters for the most part.
So,
there were bigger people living in the Brewsters.
Yeah.
But they systematically shut them down. They shut the money off to them, and through 10 years, it just depleted. Brought the property down.
So, I mean, I think you could argue, I think the argument could be made that there was a grand strategy that happened over the last 60 years of divestment from Detroit to like take it over eventually now. That's like certainly debatable, but that Brewster Projects went down. I actually painted the entire side of the Brewster Projects. We were the first ones that did it. I painted NSTRS on that. That was a really cool one. But, go ahead.
I wanted to say one thing. Mike Illich is a Detroiter. He graduated from Cooley High School.
Yep.
Detroit Public High School. Gilbert is from what, Westland or Lobos?
No, Illich went out and lived in Westland where he started the first Little Caesars.
Right.
Well, he graduated from Cooley High School.
I think Gilbert and his family is like Farmington Hills. They live out there.
Where is Gilbert from? Westland or something?
Farmington Hills.
So that is the difference between the two.
Yeah, I mean, they don't matter to me. Like, if they're shitty capitalists, they're the same level to me. Whatever, next slide. This is actually, so it's illegal to own a sports team and a casino. So Mike Illich's wife owned the casino. He owned the sports teams for obvious reasons why you shouldn't be able to own a casino and sports team. So this is a closed high school right in front of a casino, and I thought that was like the perfect canvas to put a message about educational privatization, which is one of the major systems that's been privatized. And to be honest, the education system was the first thing that was put into emergency management over like 10 or 15 years ago when Detroit passed the big ass millage, and the green suburban white people were like, ooh, millage, we can spend it on ourselves. So we put disposable and casino capitalism on the top of this building. It got redded out immediately the next day, but we did get this nice photo.
Excuse me, I just have a comment to add to that when you're talking, while you're still on the Illiches, because it's really collusion at the utmost. They went to the policy level first to get a policy in Michigan put in place that a nonprofit organization did not have to pay real estate tax. So then they turned over their property ownership to the nonprofit entity. So all of these properties that they own, the casino, the Little Caesars Arena, the Fox Theater, the ball game, wherever you know what, y'all know the name. But all these properties that are owned are also not paying property taxes because they have converted them over to the names of the nonprofit organizations.
And the city also colluded by intentionally giving him away 39 properties in that same area for $1. I mean, so like the city like had some culpability in helping this really shitty guy. He had a lot of influence in the city. Yeah.
Which mayor now?
So,
Who we have? The black
What we
mayor?
got now?
I have like 1 minute left. Let me go real quick. So if you check out on Vimeo, there's a video we did of my neighbor's water getting shut off. So literally, they were shutting off people so this is an act of the emergency manager. He wanted to make the water system look viable, so he wanted to get lots of income going. So in order to get the income going, he started shutting off people's bills for $150 or more, whereas like large institutions had tens of thousands of dollar bills and weren't getting shut off. So this is actually a video of one of my neighbors, this Yemeni woman getting her water shut off in the middle of Ramadan. She was pregnant at the time, and 6 cops. So we stopped them from doing the shut off. And the private demolition company that was doing the water shut offs, which is another instance of privatization, neoliberalism, was actually got 6 cops and 4 cop cars to make sure that this pregnant woman's water got shut off. And we actually just turned water back on. That's what the other picture was on the right. But this is, I got arrested for this in 2015, painting Free the Water on the Highland Park water tower. And this is in opposition to this shitty politician named Monica Conyers. So when the water shut-offs were going down, she's like, well, if Detroiters want water, they can go to the river and get it themselves.
No, that was.
Yeah, so this.
That was Sheila.
Sheila Cockrell, my bad. So this mural right here kind of talks about, when it says free the water, the fish talks about that, how like, we can't go get free water because that's just been poisoned by industrial pollution. And the water's acid, the river, so you can't drink that.
Yeah.
So in the Free the Water tower is like, we don't want free water, we want to free and liberate the water system, which should be a public system that should be publicly funded and should be made available to people so it's affordable. If you are making $20,000 a year and you get a $2,000 water bill, that's 10% of your income. If you live in Bloomfield Hills or Oakland County where the average income is $80,000 a year and you have a $2,000 water bill, that's like, what, 2% of your income. So we're saying that the water should be affordable and it should be commensurate with your income, and we do not have an ally in Mike Duggan, shitty takeover mayor, who helped the emergency managers come, because he's not fighting for water affordability is what we need. And what's something that I would ask all of you to potentially do in your communities where you come from, because now you have a say in Detroit's water system, because the water system has been regionalized to the Great Lakes Water Authority. And the last thing we did is, on a positive note, is we killed Columbus a couple years ago. We put this axe in Christopher Columbus's head, which is downtown, and we got them to make it Indigenous Peoples Day. So yay, hooray. So my contact is here if you would like me to come talk more with your group, your school, your class. Take down my email. You can follow us on Facebook. You can find me on Facebook at Antonio Rafael. Woo!
I need to see it.
Wait, hold on.
I'm sorry.
How can we follow him on Facebook?
It's just Antonio Rafael, R-A-F-A-E-L. You gotta follow me, I'm gonna get too many friends. You can follow me on Instagram too, A-R-C-O-S-M-E. A-R-C-O-S-M-E on Instagram.
It's hard to just sort of snapshot what Antonio does. He's an amazing visual artist.
We can't hear you.
Not on, Peter. Not on. All right. Moving on. But amazing. So I think we should give it up to Antonio for. And then talk to him about his farm, right, and his beekeeping, right? So it's not just all the sort of activism and art that's going on. So, all right.
All right, everybody, I lack the same kind of energy and enthusiasm today after being with my child all day, but I'll do my best. I did want to start off with a kind of historical angle, but I'm going to try and take it back and then take us forward to Heinz Farms. How many of you are familiar with the Heinz Farms? Or Hans Farms, or whatever, Heinz, whatever, they're both rich people. Catch up, real estate, dime a dozen, right? But the first thing I wanted to start off with is Malcolm X. Right, Stephen, where was Malcolm X when he said revolutions are about land?
Grassroots.
About
A couple of miles that way.
yeah.
At
King Solomon Baptist Church. Oh, sorry.
He delivered the speech in Detroit, and the reason why I bring this up is because I want you all to understand the context in which Malcolm X delivered that speech, and he's talking about revolutions are about land in the midst of kind of urban renewal in Detroit, right? So just for an analogy of how this kind of shapes into kind of the land grabs that we're talking about today, if you stood in 1963 on like Forest and Shane and you looked downtown, it would look eerily familiar to how it looks today. In fact, there are pictures you can find online in which it's fields. You can almost see the pheasants like that you see now on the Near East Side in the frame of that picture. And part of that, of course, was through a program called slum clearance.
The only reason I raised my hand is I lived one block from where you're saying. I woke up at the age of 16 in the middle of the night with the house burning down with me and my brother, my mother, and the dog in there. And we ran out in our night clothes. We didn't have anything left in the morning.
Yes. I wanted to reiterate that point too, because that draws a parallel to what I'm talking about. You stand in that same area today, you see the land being cleared, right? And it's being cleared for a far different reason. Back then, you had urban renewal as a means to kind of remove Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, which if you consider it, basically ran down from the hospital district by the Wright Museum all the way downtown, right in the heart of what is now downtown. In fact, you go through Ford Field to get there, right? You go to Greektown, you go right through the heart of what is Detroit today, right? And part of the problem then was that for the capitalists in the areas, they wanted to carve out a broader central business district, right? And what they didn't want to have right up on them and right upon their properties were poor people, right? Poor black people in particular. And so we have, as somebody mentioned last week, the shortest federally funded highway in the nation, 375, that went right through the heart of Black Bottom to eviscerate that community and to create a physical barrier between the Near East Side's black population and some of the redevelopment that took place, Lafayette Towers and what have you over there, right? And this kind of burgeoning downtown. And just to think about how things flip or become inverted, right? So you had this process before to remove black people out of the downtown. The broader scheme of development didn't work as most development went to the suburbs, and a lot of the city, suffered as a result of that. Now, conversely, now you're starting to get the manifestation of a lot of the urban planning that had been going on for decades, right? To build this area and make it more profitable. And conversely, what do you have? As soon as that started to happen, right, they started to say, well, why do we have 375? Shouldn't it be an accessible, walkable community? Yeah. And now, of course, they're going to destroy it. So middle-class people or wealthy people can go commiserate and jaunt in the park with each other, right? Because they're no longer threatened, right? Now, I just wanted to kind of give you that parallel so you understand, like, in many ways, kind of the process of gentrification is the inverse process of urban renewal, right? The way in which it goes down and the ramifications for the surrounding population. Okay. Now,
and we call it Negro removal.
Yeah, nice.
Instead of urban.
Oh, no, it's hold on one second.
Right, that's what it's saying.
Yeah, just click on that, just so, yeah, that's the only hands, sorry. Thanks, hands. Yeah. All right, I think I can do this. I know the mic isn't working. But I wanted to talk to you about a particular project. Many of you are familiar with Hance Farms, right? But I wanted to give you an understanding of the value of this property and how kind of capitalists had always isolated this property long before this so-called revitalization of Detroit. This is a story that I don't think many people are aware of, and it gets to kind of some of the things that Antonio was talking about, in the sense that, like, if you had a democratically elected government, right, and people came in and they wanted to kind of like colonize a section of the town, or in the nomenclature of the time, I think it was referred to as balkanize a portion of the town, right, that person who's elected has to then be responsive to the electorate, which at the time was 87% black, right? So the first time that somebody moved on this land, which is now Hance Farms, did I say it right? Yeah. Okay, kinda. All right, you got it. All right, but this land in particular was during 1989, right? This is one of the long periods of lamentations about how Detroit wasn't hospitable for development, right? And needed growth. So what Detroit has always had, really, since 1967, was these quasi-public and private partnerships. First was New Detroit, and then later it became, under Kwame Kilpatrick, it was Next Detroit. Like, there's always some kind of rebirth happening here. But at the time, in the 80s, it was Renaissance Detroit, because we had the Renaissance Center built in the 70s, right, that was a complete flop. So all these kind of concerned industrialists and capitalists and builders got together and made proposals to Mayor Coleman Young. And one of their proposals for spurring development was to build or have a district. And I don't have the map here, but this basic section here, you see here is the hospital area, right, that was created by urban renewal. That had been the heart of the black community, had been destroyed to make way for the hospital system and its broad complex. Now on the south side of that, there wasn't a whole lot of development. And so what these people had suggested initially was that they would get the back side of that, or the bottom half, the south side, from the hospitals down into, of course, a historically beautiful neighborhood, Brush Park, right? And they were going to get this, and on top of asking for it, they said, we want the land for free, but not only do we want the land for free, what would be best for growth is if we were able to have our own police department, our own fire department, our own sanitation department, and our own schools, right? This is the benevolent business community, right? They're offering so much. Well, this idea was initially turned down, and they started to look for new areas. And ironically, right, the area they happen to select happens to be the exact fucking territory that Hans Farms went to, right? And I want you all to kind of consider how this played out. You have Mr. Hans, who lives dead up in the most affluent section of Detroit. If you all ever go there, I think you'll get his reasoning. It's a 3-block basic territory that runs north and south from Jefferson all the way up to Mack, right? And there's Iroquois, there's Seminole, and there's Burns. Yeah. And that's some of the wealthiest territory in all of the city, right? But in the 80s and 90s in particular, if you went on either side of those homes, it was some of the most impoverished sections in the community. I talked about the east side of Detroit to my classes, and people, I'll be like, you know, do you all know Mack and Bewick? I'd be like, yeah, I know Mack. And people that grew up here would be like, yeah, I know Mack and Bewick. Mack and Bewick was tremendously densely populated, and tremendously densely populated with a very impoverished population, right? So, and I wanted to kind of talk about this, because we oftentimes talk about urban farming, and I think sometimes this gets misunderstood. I want you all to understand that there is some racism in environmentalism, right? So some of the manifestations early on of greening in Detroit came from this very community. And with the logic of, if we beautify the surrounding territory, it will help increase our property values, right? So there are two sides to this coin. I want us to be very clear on this. And when we hear statistics like Detroit has the largest urban farm population, we also have to account for people like Hans, whatever the fuck his name is. That guy, land for damn near nothing, right? And so to reiterate what kind of Antonio was saying, Mike Ilitch got the land for the stadium for nothing, and then used money from the schools to fund it, right? So Hans got this land for $500,000, and think about this, and then if you clear the land around it, right, all of a sudden it happens to be not only right next to the most affluent community in Detroit, but on the bottom side of it, right, is what is known as, I don't know if you know this, Jefferson, that area, is known as the Gold Coast, right? The Gold Coast. If you all go to Chicago, the Gold Coast, look at the real estate values in the Gold Coast of Chicago, you'll understand, right? Now, initially, so this is the trick of it all. Initially, when people came over here and they asked Coleman Young, we want that land that you see highlighted, but they demanded to have the area all the way to the river, right? And they demanded this prime-ass piece of real estate. This is really a connection between what is now Midtown, so-called Midtown and downtown. It's the connection really to Eastern Market as the kind of expansion territory of gentrification towards the east side, right? Connecting it to this very wealthy neighborhood.
And Hans lives in Indian Village.
And he lives in Indian Village, right? That's part of the same thing with Greening. He wants this, he wants it not only as a property owner for his property to go up, but he clearly wants this, and he said it, to create scarcity and to clear land in a way in which he can develop whole cloth gated communities of very affluent people that he can profit off, right? So anyway, when people proposed to Coleman Young, we want this land, we want our own schools, we want our own services, because your services suck. Coleman Young came out very vocally and said, we refuse to allow Detroit to be balkanized, turned against itself, right? And so I just want you all to remember that there is political will to contest these things. There has always been political will. The only way that they're able to kind of circumvent that political will is by the direct attacks on democracy that Antonio had mentioned regarding the emergency manager. So I just want to give you that little case study and to fill you in on Hans Farms.
Thanks.
David, real quick, can you tell everybody about the movie Land Grab?
Oh yeah, I haven't seen it yet, unfortunately. There's a movie and I look forward to it. Did somebody see it? Want to talk about it? There's a movie called Land Grab. I think you can get it if you have like Netflix DVD. I don't think it's streaming, but check for it. It's specifically about the kind of movement that arose to contest, Heinz's land grab. And I will say this, when this went before the city council, it's not like nobody showed up. There were galvanized grassroots organizations that have been working on the east side for decades. And when they had public comment, 96% of the people that spoke out about this project were completely against it, most of it from that particular area, and the city council passed it anyway in a non-public meeting, right, to give you the idea of the...
I was one of the protesters, because he started with the state fair's property.
Yes.
And he did a whole
Well, I'm gonna take another minute. All right, so one thing I will say is initially this project was supposed to be a lot bigger, and it was going to connect from 6 Mile all the way down Shane. And you mentioned fires before. I lived in that area at the time. Shane, which had the least population density of any major thoroughfare in the entire city, because it had been abandoned for so long, had more fires in a 4-year period than any other section of the city. Wow. So one way to clear land is to get it from the government, but another is to pay somebody to set it on fire.
Yeah, exactly.
Look, children, they
Yeah, Halloween.
So, next perspective, there's a bunch of different ways you can be thinking about development. And you're seeing a lot of different perspectives here. And that's part of our job is to give you different perspectives. One of the things that I do to show you how exciting my life is, I read development reports. Right? And I read them to try to understand the mindset that's behind it. And you really can. There's a whole literature looking at World Bank and other development reports through a sort of literary criticism perspective. You can understand what people are trying to do, and the people here are the developers, by looking at the reports that they write. Right? So what I'm going to do is share with you some analysis that I've done about the Blight Task Force Removal, right, report, with the notion of what it tells us about development in Detroit. In this moment, but also what it tells us about the psychology behind these reports. So next, please. But we're first going to visit an alternative universe, right? Imagine that there is a federally convened task force of federal, state, city, public, private actors, chaired by one of those billionaire businessmen you saw earlier, a former university president, and a nonprofit leader. And that they're tasked to say, how can we get rid of poverty in Detroit as quick as possible? And they just released the report. This is sort of the news release that goes with it in the next slide. Poverty is a cancer. Poverty sucks the soul out of anyone who gets near it, let alone those who are unfortunate enough to live with it all around them. Poverty is radioactive. It's contagious. Poverty is also a symbol. It's a symbol of all that is wrong and all that has gone wrong for all these decades from the once thriving world-class city of Detroit. But we're going to get rid of it, right? We are going to have an aggressive plan to eliminate all poverty in a 5-year period. We're going to commit $2 billion to the effort, and this is going to be an all-hands-on-deck strategy. That's not what happened, right? This is the actual press release, right? And it's talking about blight. And Stephen reminded me that there's a whole history of talking about blight in a highly racialized way, where it's not just the property, but it's the people who are the contagion. And this is coming out of the introduction signed by those 3 august people. That blight is a cancer. Blight sucks the soul out of anyone who gets near it, let alone those who are fortunate enough to live with it all around them. Blight is radioactive. It's contagious. Blight is also a symbol of all that is wrong and gone wrong for too many decades in the once thriving world-class city of Detroit. So in 5 years, we're going to get rid of all the blight. right? We're going to spend $2 billion to get rid of blight, not end poverty. And this is an all-hands-on-deck strategy. Next slide. And that's the copy of the report, right? Every neighborhood has a future. Anybody heard that before? Right? What context did you hear that? It also, surprise, coincident, became Duggan's campaign slogan. So how do these things happen to be all intertwined in the same time from different sectors? The major themes I want to tell you is that values matter. And if development is about people or getting rid of poverty, it's a very different world than if development is about property. And that context about ending poverty versus ending blight tells you what is the most important thing that we consider in ending or framing notions of development. Furthermore, you want to think about the Blight Task Force report in the same context of the Detroit Future City report and the bankruptcy plan of adjustment that were happening in a roughly contemporaneous time. The Blight Task Force report, and we'll go through some slides, is actually one of the mechanisms of getting rid of blight or getting rid of vacant property is one of the mechanisms that's necessary to implement the vision of Detroit Future City. And then we're going to finance that through the bankruptcy plan of adjustment to show how it's all interrelated. But I'm going to show you, if you look at the report, there's absolutely no root cause analysis of blight. Right? So we're going to end it without knowing how it was caused. And we're not going to have any economic factors or theories that tell us why exactly we're going to be spending $2 billion in this way. And then we'll end talking about what an alternative development system would work. Some maps that are coming out of Detroit Future City, and I'll post these slides, so you have to sort of strain your eyes, and these colors are not great. But the whole missing piece in Detroit Future City was looking at where there was low occupancy land, right? And here is kind of the purplish colors, and a little bit of the orange is the low occupancy periods. That's going to be the pivot around which all the planning is going to take place. One of the ways you're going to go from low occupancy to no occupancy over a 50-year period is systemic disinvestment in land. So the next slide shows you where we're going to put investment in our infrastructure and our utilities. Those same areas that are low density, or low occupancy, are slated for decommissioning of roads, right? Decommissioning of public utilities, no further public investment. The sort of pale purplish colors are going to be ultimately green infrastructure. You would have existing houses surrounded by meadows in 50-year future. And we're going to have no increased improvement in utilities there. The darkest areas, we're going to actually have increased investment, public investments, and you're going to get the industrial spine of the city, but also the 7.2 miles. Really being the only parts of residential areas that are going to be slated for any form of investment. And the grand vision is going to be turning those low vacancy areas or low occupancy areas into alternative uses where there's going to be no people, or these no residential units, and turn the other range of low occupancy areas into this green agriculture.
Did they say what's going to happen to the people?
Great questions. Right? We got a wise audience, and not necessarily, right? If you're looking at property or not people, that's not even necessarily a question that you're aggressively trying to answer. That's a hard thing to do, right? To change property. This is a picture of Detroit that highlights how fragmented the land is. Right? So just imagine that you wanted to accomplish this vision. How the heck are you going to go about it, right? And we're talking about the ability to assemble land, acquire land, where the land is at. That's a huge challenge if you're going to start looking at large swaths of land. And that's where you're going to see the connection between Detroit Future City and the Blight Removal Task Force report. Detroit Future City is really a dead letter unless I can deal with that issue of fragmentation. Right? Without using eminent domain. The main public instrument you would use is eminent domain. They didn't want to use that because that costs money. Right? There's all sorts of other Michigan legal complications that limit your ability. So the question is, how can I take private land and convert it to public? How can it be aggregated? Because I don't want little parcels, I want large swaths of land. And then how can I spit it out in terms of alternative uses? Next slide, please. And that's where Dr. Seuss comes in. Right? You need a pretty impressive whiz-bang machine if you're going to get all of that done, picking up all the parcels, cleaning them up, spitting them back out. And that's really a picture of the land bank. Right? That is the job of the land bank. But we need to reassemble. If you look at the Blight Task Force report from a lens of trying to reassemble all of that land, you start to see both the logic of it, but you see the interconnection with Detroit Future City. There are so many ways, and an increasing number of ways in Detroit, to take people's land. Right? I can do it through criminal activity. If there's criminal activity, I can have civil forfeiture. I can do it through nuisance abatement, which is outrageously aggressive in Detroit compared to other places. I have the tax foreclosures that were talked about by Antonio. I can have these new blight tickets that they were proposing to have another way to get at them. And implicitly, this is not in the blight task force report, I can use water shutoffs and water bills as a way to leverage liens upon property taxes and get people to lose their property there. Well, the problem is that the legal system is just too inefficient. So the Blight Task Force removal report was also looking at different ways that it could speed up the forfeiture process, privatize again, try to have automated outsourcing for the hearing notice process, so we can sort of crank up the notices, speed up the foreclosure process, and bundle all of this land that would then be redistributed through auctions and other mechanisms, right? And really you have to start thinking about the land bank and focusing on the land bank as the primary machine, that sort of Dr. Seuss machine for reassembling and redistribution of land, right? If you look at that report, and I have a copy over here, you read in the distribution, if you saw what was given you, the article about the 3 R's, race, regionalism, reconciliation. Very simple mantra that gives you a framework to do a critique of any one of these reports. And if you have these PDF searchable documents, it's very easy to say, where does it talk about race, right? Type in race, push my search button. In this document, it's all about blight, and blight is about land and housing is all about discrimination and redlining and restrictive covenants going back for 100 years, right? There is no mention, not the word, let alone a discussion or historical analysis, no mentions of the word race, racism, discrimination, segregation, black, white flight, right? No mention of redlining or reverse redlining. No mention of poverty and a discussion of tax foreclosures. Right? You don't have tax foreclosures, so you have poverty. It mentions predatory when they're trying to complain about speculators manipulating the auction, the land auction. Doesn't talk about predatory lending. Right? We're just coming out, and this report is given over an era of predatory lending. So none of the 3 R's. It doesn't do a root cause analysis, and admits it doesn't do a root cause analysis because it wasn't asked. That was not part of their mandate to do a root cause analysis. And these are quotes from the report. Even the swiftest and most aggressive fight against today's blight will accomplish very little if we don't address the conditions that led to it. Detroit's collapsing structures and vacant lots didn't just happen. But these issues clearly fall outside the scope of our report. Because the report, if you look at their mandate was to say, how do I get rid of blight as fast as I can? And the answer was, with as many bulldozers as you can buy. Right? You ask that question, you get that answer. They're not trying to do a root cause analysis. Well, certainly if you have a billionaire businessman, there must going to be some notion of this is going to be economically justified. Well, there's no economic analysis in the report to say why they're doing it, how they're doing it, and what's the return on investment. Marty Kopax, who wrote the feasibility study of the bankruptcy plan of adjustment, so there was not even any effort to do any kind of economic rate of return on the blight investment. Is this good? Right? And after she's saying that none of this was done, she became a cheerleader about saying we should spend money, exit financing, out of the bankruptcy plan of adjustment for the blight removal. Right? No effort to model the local property market. Right? What does it look like? How does it function? How will it respond to removal of blight? What will be its effect upon prices in property markets? But only this magical thinking about if you knock it down, things will get better. All right, so where are we now? Right, that didn't happen. Right, so we're going to say the good thing is they didn't get the exit financing out of the bankruptcy plan of adjustment. In some respects, it became a dead letter. It didn't have the impact that it was intended to have, but that doesn't mean that that's not the agenda. Right, so I don't get it out of my task force or the exit financing out of the bankruptcy plan of adjustment. Where do you think we got a lot of the money that we're spending to knock down houses? Anybody hear of the hardest hit funds? Yes. Right? The hardest hit funds that were supposed to keep people in their houses that were facing private mortgage foreclosure was reconverted to be the financing system to be knocking down the buildings we have. Right? So there's different ways to accomplish the same objectives, even if it's not the same one. And you really can put these 3 reports together, the bankruptcy plan of adjustment, blight removal, the Detroit Future City, as an MRI. Right? You kind of read them, you deconstruct them, you start to get into the mindset and psychology of what is the vision that developers have for the future. Right? And if it doesn't work one way, it can work another. If my real problem is all that parcelized land, that too much land is small and is owned by private actors, there's a bunch of other ways I can understand things that are shaping our city that are doing the same purpose as the Blight Task Force report. I can ramp up the tax foreclosures. Right? I can ramp up the water shutoffs. I can have these new incentive things, the Goldberg Brownfield bill, which we didn't talk about today, but hopefully we can talk a little bit about next week. Right, so what are we going to do? Right? At one level, it comes back to values, which I gave you that first slide about, are we going to get rid of poverty and spend $2 billion to fight poverty in the city, which is a people-focused notion of development, or do we look at property? Right? And the whole notion that we're trying to put out at the Key Center in the Equity Lab is thinking about development as an equitable, people-focused enterprise and not a property-focused enterprise. We have to understand in that root cause analysis that blight is a symptom, it's not a cause. And that we need community-led processes in which we're going to try to fight the problem of blight. People here will tell you blight's a problem. So the notion here is not to say blight is not real, but it's the people in the neighborhoods who should be involved in the process of determining when buildings go down, how they're going to be constructed, and what is the social opportunity cost of the money that we're having to take down the buildings. There are programs. Do I know the best way to prevent blight? Keep people in their homes. Right? One of these no-brainer win-win-win scenarios, keep people in their homes, the home doesn't become blighted. And yet all of our policies are property-focused and trying to get people out of their homes so we can convert the land from private to public. And then we really need to create opportunities and meaning for Detroit residents. Right? We've got to be part of our own solution. So, back to the future. The reward you get here, and this is the last slide, what's this picture of? Redlining, right here you said. Right? So we have other visions of development that included redlining who got money, who did not get money. A recent report out this week that showed that black Detroiters were 2 times more likely to be denied a mortgage than white Detroiters. These things are still with us. Right? So we've got to know our history, we've got to know the current dynamics, and we've got to see what we're going to do with that knowledge. So that's that report. This is a train running fast night, so we had time to all sit together in a small group, right? We wanted to get your input. This is supposed to be not just people talking at you, but trying to figure out how you can talk to each other as well as get feedback. I still want to give it up to Antonio. I thought I was just rocking today. I want to thank Stephen for his visioning exercise to get us beyond development, and David for his history of Hans Farms. But now's your opportunity. I'd ask if Antonio and David and Stephen could kind of come up if people have questions. But it's not just questions of us, if you have comments, and we had such great colloquies between people who are resonating with their life experience in this. We'll just open the floor and say, do people have questions, comments, reactions about beyond development and land grabs?
Peter, I know the one comment that was coming there, and when you were talking, there was a question there. I was like, those two.
One thing real quick, we have about 20 minutes, and so I was just going to encourage people to try and keep their comments to maybe a minute or less, so we can get as many people, if not 30 seconds, many people talking as possible.
So the 2 mystery people Stephen identified.
That's one mystery, and then,
All right.
you had your hand up, right?
Yeah, so two quick things. One, I've been working at the land bank for the last year, and yeah, that presentation was the kind of conversation that we have every single day. And it's tough to be in an environment where you're working really hard towards a goal that you think is positive, but you're stuck in a system that's very clearly in neutral, if not going in a negative. The other thing on the Hans Williams topic, so that deal was, I think, in 2009, and that purchase agreement had the option for round 2 of Hans buying property in that footprint from the city. And it was like a 10-year thing, where like 10 years from now, we'll reassess the situation and see if the city will sell more to Hans.
Yes.
Well, we're almost 10 years out now. That conversation is happening right now. And it will have to go to city council just like it did the last time. So, I mean, the only solace I can say is that for those of you who are Detroit residents, when that goes to council, make your voices heard that we don't want consolidated ownership of land.
I believe it's every house in a 1 mile radius that comes up, back to the land bank or otherwise.
Other mystery guest.
So can you pull up the map that you had in this last presentation?
The red line, the rich one?
The one redlining?
Like way up at the top. Future city? Yeah.
This one?
So yes, so my question was for, and this just could be my ignorance as a person who's not from the city of Detroit, but could you explain a little bit about why they were gonna put a lot of money into Southwest and that strip at the top?
Yeah, so the darkest portions are the portions getting of public utility funds and infrastructure upgrades. That is the kind of what's left of the industrial backbone, right? So Southwest is not getting upgrades for its neighborhoods, it's getting upgrades for Marathon and the other things. The only area that has kind of quasi-residential, right, would be the 7.2 miles, right? And again, the only part slated for infrastructure upgrades.
That black strip on the top is 6 now, though. That's residential and business.
I think that would be McNichols and.
Eds and meds, University of Detroit, Wayne County Community College Hospitals,
Yeah.
from 6 Mile, Illinois, all the way out to Southfield.
I just want to add to Peter's comment about like Southwest, is that part of the investment in Southwest, as we shift, obviously, we're post-industrial, a lot of the emphasis on kind of economies today has to do with moving goods, transportation hub. And of course, you have not only the rail lines, but also the kind of hidden railways that used to go to the Ford factory. So in terms of logistics, that's a key point for people's development. That's why Matty Maroon has held on to that area for so long.
So a whole bunch of hands.
Is going up. Matty Maroon has the bridge going up in Southwest Detroit. Another bridge. Next to the park.
So I saw a bunch of hands. I guess it was just sort of popcorn in to keep it
He made a
quick.
comment and I didn't quite understand. Could you please define consolidated ownership of land and how it works?
In the context of hands, or?
In general, because I see what I saw. I went to a meeting a few weeks ago where the people were all happy because they were getting some upgrades on their housing. But as they did that, they were being sold energy, solar panels, some of them and stuff like that, but they were going to have to pay $3 more a month for it. Whereas I know when you get a solar panel, you get enough energy where you should be able to sell it. You should be making money. But DTE is telling them a completely different story and telling them $3 is a profit. And that looked like what I think consolidated ownership is. So you're giving up your rights to income and entrepreneurship, and the land is owned by the land bank. You're just sitting in the building that's on it, so they can throw you off that building at any time. That's the way I understood it. And I'm wondering, maybe you don't know all what I'm saying.
No, I think I follow what you're saying. So the land bank doesn't own houses that.
But they tell you what you
occupied.
can do with the houses because it's sitting in that area. So you can only do what they tell you.
No, I'm not familiar with that, but I mean, I was.
DTE is a monopoly. DTE is definitely an energy
DTE was
monopoly.
monopolizing
Yeah.
the energy in that area through the land bank.
Like 96 in Greenfield area? Talk about that
You got it.
solar array?
We're close.
Okay,
Yes.
okay. But yeah, I'm about to talk more about that. I'm not familiar, but I'm
Okay.
going to learn.
Yeah, okay, so.
I was talking in the context of hands. I was saying that if I'm a voter or if I'm a city councilor, the last thing I want to do is sell multiple parcels of property to one person because he has a good idea, because he has the financing to support owning it all at once. Like, each piece of property needs to have its own story. I don't want to say everything to this guy because he has a good idea. I agree.
And Hans owns a bank too. I mean, that's like another part of this. Is like he owns a. And so another huge farm in the city is called
Recovery Park.
and that guy owns a financial institution as well. I did a presentation in Yad Ezra, a Jewish nonprofit in Southfield, and he, the owner of Recovery Park, was at that presentation. And as a financial person, he blamed the financial crisis on black people, like straight up. Like he straight up said it was because financial institutions have to give loans to poor people because if they don't, they'll be sued. And if a good financial institution like his refused to give loans to poor people, they would say, "Fine, I'll get it somewhere else." So that was his interpretation of the 2008 financial crisis. I about shat my pants. I was like, that is like the most disturbing description of victim blaming I've ever heard in my entire life. Something like 70, if you of equal like educational level, income level, if you were a black person, you were 70% more likely to have been foreclosed upon than a white person of this, like of the same income. So it's just like the 2008 financial crisis had a huge racial component to it. Exactly the opposite. Not to mention the derivative products and all the nonsense that was happening there.
So I want anybody with questions raise their hands, right? And what I'm going to do is kind of go through and ask you to kind of just ask your question briefly, and we'll take these four, and then we can put this back in terms of the folks and get responses. But
I just wanted to mention the podcast Revealed did a very interesting show this last week about the way that loans manipulate people into poverty and how basically the way that it's done and the way that it will reinforce the racism in the economic system and in financial institutions. So check that out.
Great.
It's called Reveal.
Was this based on a recent study about lending practices and how people of similar financial means get far worse loans?
Yeah, I think that's what it was based on. I didn't catch all of it, but it was about Santander and a bunch of other financial institutions. So it's called Reveal. I'm sure you can just find it on whatever podcast.
Great. So again, we're going to get about 3 comments.
I was gonna ask what policies and things are these people that can come in and just like buy a whole bunch of like land? Like what are they taking advantage of? Like, I guess. Does that make sense? Because I'm not sure how they can get away with this. How can they get away with?
So I'd rephrase and say that you have economic market failures and political market failures. From that feeling, what are the political market failures going on? Comment? You better project, please.
So basically, I think 3 things. Number 1 is all the instructors here, speakers here, talk about the expansion of new liberal policy paradigm and social consequences, and I just want to add one thing which I found intellectually fun, but in reality it's not fun at all. Since 2014, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. So basically, there are more security workers than high school, secondary school teachers in this.
More security than there are.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is what happens after you commodify security. And this is, I think, have a lot to do with the police brutality and also the devastating crime rate in the urban areas, which include Detroit in the United States. And second thing I want to mention is a lot of people, when we talk about development, particularly economy of development, we mean the physical area. But I also want to add a dimension to it is the cyberspace. Because in a lot of cases, when my friends in the University of Michigan, when they talk about technology, they also got a tendency of romanticizing technology. They think it will lead to democracy, they think it will lead to development. But I would argue that's just what's going on here. It will never happen because hyper-connection only happens in certain social groups which are exclusive to the others. And this leads to the polarization of identity and also ideas. And this is where I think it's exactly happening in Michigan. And I do think in the future, probably we should discuss this a little bit more about the cyber dimension of the world.
Can I add something? Once the information...
We're trying to get people who haven't spoken yet, so we'll be coming back, but I want to sort of honor people that have not had a chance to speak.
The question is, how do we derail this process? I mean, it's apparent that every neighborhood doesn't count. No matter what Dugan says. Now, people are being affected in major different ways by losing their homes, by having slumlords, by having, by people who, parasites that bought up all this property, all the various ways by water shut off. How do we bring that to people so that it effectively, to just derail this whole BS, rah BS.
How do we educate?
So we got 4 good questions. I'll just ask people to invite responses.
The next several sessions, we will in different ways be trying to show the different ways people are trying to create alternatives and therefore derail. That's a quick partial.
On the technology tip, I wanted to mention the M1 rail. The whole point of our article that we wrote was the idea that underneath the M1 rail is a high-speed internet line, Rocket Fiber, which is the fastest internet available in Detroit. And Dan Gilbert's, so he's been buying up real estate and offices up and down the M1 rail line. He can't fill all those offices. There aren't enough people interested in renting those offices. He has a lot of vacant office space. His intention is to fill that space in San Francisco, Detroit, by putting the tech sector in there. So for the last 5 or 6 years, he's been flying between between San Francisco in other tech sectors and trying to lure tech people. So I think your point about like the way the cyber economy helps stratify our society is a very true and real point. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that going ahead, because all of the buildings that he had are all rocket fiber buildings. I mean, so this rocket fiber is something that is going to be used as a way to hyper gentrify a significant portion of downtown Detroit. So yeah, like I think that was super on point, and yeah, that was it.
Yeah, there are organizations that are working to close what is the connectivity gap in the city. Because obviously, poor people don't have access to the internet, especially at the rates in which it's increasing dramatically. So people are on a very DIY scale trying to do that, but it's not enough to cover the vast chasm that you're talking about.
It is happening institutionally as well. The Allied Media, Allied Media is a really amazing group. You can check them out online. They have a project where they're trying to do like community internet in a number of spaces throughout the city. There's a group called the Digital Justice Coalition, and that as an organization is working to like create internet democracy. Which I think this is like one of the biggest things. Is like we don't think about the way like the internet should be a public system. The United States government developed that shit. Like we paid for it. Like there's no reason that it should be kicked down to private owners. We need to nationalize his little electrical shit, and we need to take that over. Or his little cable internet stuff. And I think that there needs to be a serious conversation around land redistribution in Detroit. The fact of the matter is like 1 in 3 people losing their homes. Like black folks need to be getting land in the city as it's growing and increasing. And I think that's like needs to be a serious conversation. A lot of people unjustly lost their houses, and that just should be a political agenda.
So I'm gonna. They need the internet, and you know, in Europe, I'd like to see. I came up with this idea today. If we would look at the places in Europe that have internet for all their people, free, let's see if they have more democracy and more participation of people, because they can communicate. How do you make a community when you can't communicate?
Or when poor people can't communicate.
All right, so I have one last question, and then we're going to throw it to Craig for logistics and announcements.
The city recently announced a plan to go zip code by zip code and started enforcing.
Say it louder.
The city announced a plan recently to go zip code by zip code and start doing a better job of enforcing rental properties being up to code. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know on one hand it does help conditions in some places, but it's also going to artificially raise housing stock and prices, maybe driving out poor communities.
Traditionally, I would say that this has been used disproportionately against single-family homeowners. I think we've seen this already in Duggan's, Detroit. Like the enforcement, I live in Morningside, which is scheduled to be a forest, but the community next to me is East English Village, which is deemed for survival, charted for survival. But what they started to do, because some people got homes there quite cheaply during the housing crisis, is they started to then enforce code regulations, and a whole bunch of new people who had just got houses subsequently lost their houses as property values were just starting to go up. Now we know kind of from experience, right, with water, is that these things are enforced disproportionately. Like people that are down on their water bills or behind, those were poor homeowners that were getting in strategic areas too, right? We can chart where those homes were that were, you know, disproportionately focused for shut-offs. We could see that in a mapping. But we could also see the numerous kind of business owners and industrialists and Illich and others, including what was Joe Louis Arena, who had damn near $1 million in water bills, and they weren't even made to pay a fine. So I mean, I would just suggest that this would be an opportunity for more of the same, you know, in many respects. The problem that people in these communities face is that this is the kind of catch-22. You live in a community where you can't get a homeowner's loan to fix your house, and then you're being, you know, hemmed up by the city government for not being able to fix up your house. And they're not providing you money to fix up your house, right? So you're being held accountable for something you can't possibly do unless you have large amounts of cash on hand, and who, of course, would disfavor people with capital. And as you mentioned before, discrepancies in capital differences, black and white, went from like 1 to 12 to 1 to 50 in like a 4-year window, right? So I don't, you know, that scares me, quite frankly.
We got a bus to catch. I will just say one thing, and I'm going to throw it to Craig. You're seeing a pivot in the course, right? And I love this sort of activism in these questions. Keep that energy going. And we're really going to start looking how people have responded. So next week is how the community is grabbing back, right, with different reactions in the community for it. And we have wonderful thoughts about a way technology can be used. We have another about a shared economy. So we'll be looking at alternative models as we go forward and looking at ways that we can derail this process. But Craig, the floor is yours.
And I'm going to make one point first, because I wanted to interject this one thing, and then I'm going to invite a couple people to make announcements, or at least 2 people want to make announcements. But we're in an election year, and I think it's really important to remember, Antonio described the emergency management takeover of the city of Detroit and other communities in the state. Jennifer Granholm, right, the most recent Democratic governor we've had, was the first person to appoint Robert Bobb, the emergency manager of the Detroit Public Schools. So it's tempting to frame this primarily as sort of a right-wing, kind of Republican-fueled.
It was John Engler first, no?
Even before that.
President of Michigan State.
My point is, this is a bipartisan thing at some level, and we should keep that in mind as we think about, who we're going to be electing. And I don't know who our alternative is, but that's a whole other conversation. In any case, so thank you for letting me squeeze that in there. We had 2 announcements, I believe, at least 2 people I know back here, Meg, right? And then we had one other announcement. Maybe there's a third. Real quick. Sorry, David's got one too. So maybe really loudly and quickly, please. Thank you.
Okay, we have a petition here for earned paid sick time. So if you are a resident of Michigan in either Oakland, Washtenaw, Maine, or Macomb, will you please sign the petition so that we can get people earned paid sick time?
Thank you.
Detroit Addiction Defense is having a clinic, calling people in the community to come together to organize, particularly around this whole question of this new ordinance and enforcing it, not just in one place, but all over. Because part of the process of tax foreclosures was we went from a city that had the largest black home ownership to one that has much less and many more renters, and they're being affected by this. And at the same time, we have a white report coming out, and I don't know what they call it, white paper, or whatever you call the thing, by one of our kind of statisticians about the effects of lead poisoning, the increase in lead poisoning, because it's also been related to this whole problem. But it'll be this Saturday coming up over at St. John's Church, Old St. John's Church, 2120 Russell. And it'll be basically trying to address this new thing, the whole issue of slumlords and culture investors.
The group's name was Detroit Eviction Defense, if you want to look them up. Quickly back here, sorry, Monique.
Yes. Please be sure to get one of these brochures off of the table. This is talking about gerrymandering, and we have the largest amount of gerrymandering going on. Redistricting and the redrawing of lines in intricate areas, intentionally designed to have some people in and exclude some people. So just take a look to become completely informed and understand that you can protest against it. Thank you.
Those are available on the table back there. Cindy, quickly, and then we got David.
Also, there's
There's a meeting tomorrow night on Dick. If you want one of these flyers, just, I'll give you on your way out.
It's around water. It's a meeting around water increases prices.
They usually have a meeting once a month. It's DAART, Detroit Alliance Against the Rain Taxes. So if you go to DAART.org, you can read the case that they filed, and we need more people to join the class action, 50 for residents, 500 for
Thank you. Thank you, Cindy.
And then 1 week from tomorrow at 2 o'clock, the Great Lakes Water Authority, that's on the backside of the state flyer.
Great.
They're having another rate increase. They do this every year. EWSC has a rate increase, so does Great Lakes. And I went to Westland.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you. Don't leave yet.
Hold on, I got one more announcement for you, and it's timely regarding the class. We end this class kind of talking about the new Poor People's Campaign. So there is a meeting for the Poor People's Campaign. It is February 23rd, Friday, at 9:30. It's at the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And you are invited to participate in a National Poor People's Campaign strategy meeting. So this is a way to not only learn about the movement that's coming up, but to actively participate and voice, where you see this going, and hear from people that have already been organizing and see what they're organizing towards.
And Mama Lila, and then we're almost done.
Back on the table is a newsletter from People's Platform about amending the CDA, and it relates directly to this conversation in terms of how developers have not given benefits to the community, and they've taken away, just like what was described in terms of Little Caesars. Little Caesars. So please take one of those, because that's how you can act on what you learn.
And we meet next in 2 weeks, not next week, in 2 weeks. And the name of that is called Equitable Development, Grassroots Grabbing Back. And we're going to have Bernadette Atuane from Wayne State talking about the tax assessment crisis in the Detroit, Sarita Scott Montgomery, and others. So thank you.